Hey everybody, it's Dan the Chess Enthusiast here with my Grandmaster game of the Alekhine Modern variation. And the game that we're going to look at today was played between two Russian Grandmasters in 1996. Playing as white, we have Garry Kasparov, ranked 2785 at the time, and playing as black, we have Vasily Ivanchuk, ranked 2730. And the reason I chose this game was because, first of all, it's a Kasparov game, and he's obviously one of the best players to ever live, and examining his games can definitely teach us a lot. And the other reason is because Black variated a little bit from the main line, and I think ultimately was punished for it. So I think this game is a good example of how easy it is to slip up in the Alekhine's defense if you're playing as Black, especially against a player of Kasparov's caliber. But I think ultimately what this game will show us is that if you're playing as Black, you definitely want to be careful and precise in your moves. So let's get started here. We have obviously the Alekhine's defense. We very quickly get into the modern variation here on move 4, signified by the knight out to f3. And from here, Black decides to go into the fianchetto variation with pawn to g6. As I said in my last video, I felt that this was not as good of a position for Black to go into. I think much better here is the immediate bishop down to g4, attacking the knight. But that's not what Ivanchuk played. He played the fianchetto variation, pawn to g6. From here, Kasparov develops his bishop and attacks the undefended knight on d5. And instead of retreating the knight to b6, which is the most played move in the position, Black decides to defend the knight with pawn to c6. Now, there are two minor problems with this move. The first one is that if white wants to, it can give black doubled pawns here on the d-file. And the other problem is that the knight here on b8 in almost all variations of the Alekhine comes to c6, or at least it really wants to come to c6. But now this pawn is here on c6, and this knight on b8 has no really good square to develop to. Eventually it's probably going to find a home on d7, but then it will be hindering the development of Black's light square bishop, which is why this knight usually comes to c6, which it can't in this position, so that's why I think a better move would have been simply to follow the main line and jump the knight to b6. So continuing on here, white castles and black fianchettos the bishop. White plays pawn to h3, which is limiting the scope of the light square bishop and also giving white's king an escape square for future use. Black castles, and white decides to open up the e-file by capturing on d6, and then when black recaptures, white simply slides his rook over to e1, and we have firm control of the e-file for white. From here, black jumps the knight back to c7. Again, I think a better move would have been just to jump the knight back to b6, because what this move is doing, jumping the knight to c7, is, well, what it's not doing is it's not attacking this bishop. And what it is doing is it's now giving this bishop a pin on this f7 pawn, which Kasparov obviously takes immediate advantage of and plays the bishop to g5. This pawn can't advance to kick away this bishop, and it's just a really good move from white. Now, black played the bishop to g5, the bishop to f6, probably hoping that white would exchange the dark square bishops, but that's not what white had in mind. Instead, white plays the bishop now to h6 and forces white to play the rook over to e8. In this position, white captures the rook with check, and black, I think, makes another dubious move and recaptures with the knight. I think probably a better move would have been to recapture with the queen, because if we look at this position, recapturing with the knight, this knight really has no good squares to go to except for going back to c7. So that's why I think capturing with the queen would have been a bit better in the position. However, as I say, black decided to capture with the knight. From here, play continues as follows, with white pulling the bishop back to b3, because after black pushes the pawn to d5, white is now free to play the pawn to c4, and black captures the bishop, and black captures the pawn, and white recaptures with the bishop. And you'll notice that now white has a small liability in the position, and that it has an isolated pawn here on d4, which black, if it plays correctly, would be able to exploit. And Kasparov now is going to have to work towards liquidating that liability, which, as you'll see pretty soon, he's able to do. So from here, now we have the knight jumping to d6, which is attacking white's bishop. White pulls the bishop back to b3, and the knight jumps to f5, which is attacking white's other bishop. But instead of pulling the bishop back right away, we have white simply develop the queen to d2, which is giving that bishop a defender. From here, black develops his knight to d7, which, as I mentioned before, is really not that good of a square because now he's completely blocked in the light square bishop on c8. And white simply develops his knight to c3. And now black decides to capture that bishop on h6, and white recaptures with the queen, putting it on a very good square for now. And black plays yet another really dubious move. I'm not quite sure why black plays the following move, which is knight to f8, because from this square, the knight isn't doing really anything except for making way for this light square bishop to come out. Other than that, I really can't see any advantage to having this move. Maybe what black was thinking was after it develops the bishop here to e6, white can capture, and then black will be able to recapture and get the knight into a more active position. But as we'll see, that doesn't work out for black. I think a better move would have been simply to develop the knight to b6, because from here the knight is in a slightly more active position. And as I said before, usually you see a knight here on b6 in the Aлекhine's defense. However, after we have knight to f8 from black, white continues with moving the rook over to d1. Black does develop his bishop to e6. Like I said, I think he's hoping that Kasparov is going to capture with his light square bishop, and then black will recapture. But obviously Kasparov doesn't do that. He sees a better move in the position, and that is to push the pawn to d5. In this way, Kasparov is able to liquidate the only liability that he had in the position, that isolated center pawn. He's done it in a safe manner, and it's just a good move from Kasparov. In this position, black moves his rook over to c8, gaining control of the open c-file. But in doing so, the rook vacates the defense of the a7 pawn, and Kasparov moves his queen back to e3 to attack that pawn. Black defends by playing pawn to b6, and white jumps the knight up to e5. Black brings the rook down to c5, and you'll notice that black now has enough attackers on the knight on d4 so that it can be captured. However, that's not a situation that Kasparov immediately responds to. Instead, Kasparov jumps the knight to g4, and instead of initiating some sort of exchange here on d5, black opts to simply capture that knight with the light square bishop, and white recaptures with the pawn. Now, in this position, you might be thinking that the bishop can come down here and grab the pawn that's here on b2 that's undefended. Unfortunately, that is a really big blunder, because after that happens, maybe you can see it already, but the knight can jump to e7, and we have a discovered attack against black's queen. The king is in check, and even if the queen captures the knight here on e7, white's queen is going to be able to recapture, and it's going to be game over for black. So instead, in this position, black moves his king to g7, which is doing a couple of things. One, it's taking it out of the range of this knight for the short term anyway, from hitting any checks. Two, it's adding another defender to this bishop. And three, it's keeping an eye on the h6 square. From here, white starts to push his pawns on the king side, with the idea being of, on the next move, pushing the pawn to g5, which would give this bishop here a lot of headaches. So to prevent that, black plays pawn to h6. In response, white pushes the pawn to f5, and black pushes his pawn to g5. And now, since the pawn advancement on the king side is no longer a threat, this bishop, if it wanted to, could come down and grab this pawn here on b2. So to prevent that, white plays the queen back to e2. Now, in this position, we're going to stop here, and I'm going to say that black makes a really big blunder, because if we go back to this position right here, move 19, black played knight to f8. And remember, I pointed out that this was just not a very good move, because the knight is not doing anything in this position and really has no good squares to jump to. Now, if we go to move 29, 10 moves later, from black, black decides that he wants to get his knight into a more active position. Unfortunately, there are no good squares for black to move the knight to. Obviously, moving to e6 and g6 would just lose the knight immediately, and moving to d7 creates a really, really dangerous position. It actually loses a pawn and would probably be the equivalent of losing the game. Let me just show you what that would look like. You can have the knight to d7. The knight from white can capture the bishop on f6. The king can recapture, because if the queen recaptures, then black just drops the knight here on d7. So the king has to recapture. The rook can come up and hit a check on the king, forcing the king back to g7. And then if white wants to, white can simply capture the pawn. And after the king recaptures, we have queen to e6 hitting a check. And black is going to lose this knight here on d7 on the next move. He's already gone down a pawn, and if you're playing in this position against Garry Kasparov, if he's white in this position and you're black, if I was playing, I would just resign right now, because you have two major pieces against a very exposed king. This knight is going to be taken off the board here very soon. And this queen is kind of in a good defensive position, although not the best. And this rook is really kind of out of play at the moment. So this is just a really dangerous position for for black. Which is why in this position, if black wants to get the knight more into the game, he has to play the knight to h7. Unfortunately, what this does is it creates a really big, in fact, 2-point plus positional advantage for white. And Kasparov, obviously being the great player that he is, immediately spots this, and in a couple of moves is able to wrap up the win from this position. So what Kasparov does is capture the bishop on f6. The queen recaptures, because you'll notice that there was a discovered attack on the queen from the rook on d1, so the queen recaptures on f6. From here, the rook jumps up to the 7th rank, and we have now a lot of pressure on the f7 pawn, and a lot of pressure on the undefended pawn on a7. From here, black plays the best move in the position, which is rook over to e5, but unfortunately this simply isn't enough, because white can come in and capture the pawn with check. White can recapture the rook with the queen, and then white can capture the rook with its queen, hitting another check. Black can block the check with the queen down to f6, and then the queen can play to c7 and hit a check against black. Now in this position, black plays the king over to h8, and Kasparov, I think, realizing that he has a completely winning position, decides to play a prophylactic move, the king over to h1, getting it really out of the range of this queen. The queen could have maybe hit a check at some point on d4, and I think Kasparov was just thinking, I don't want anything to do with that. I'm just going to put my king into total safety before I continue with my attack. From here, black pushes the pawn to a5 to try to protect it, and you'll notice that the queen is now the only defender of this pawn on b6, and bishop to e6 actually severs that connection, and the pawn is going to be free for the taking. Black in this position plays the knight back to f8, but before Kasparov can make his next move, Ivanchuk resigns, because again he's gonna lose this pawn. He's probably gonna lose this pawn pretty soon too. And when you're down 2 pawns in the endgame against a player like Kasparov, that's as good as a resignable position. So yeah, that is why black resigned in this position. So That is the Grandmaster game again for the Alekhine Modern variation. I hope you've enjoyed the video. You got something out of it. Questions and comments are, of course, welcome. And yeah, thanks for watching. Take care. Bye.